Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Bite number 239, dated April 27th, 2021. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled President Gerald Ford's Supreme Court Justice. Gerald Rudolph Ford served as the 38th President of the United States of America from August 9th, 1974 to January 20th, 1977. Gerald Rudolph Ford was the only man to serve as president and as vice president and was elected to neither office. How, you may ask? Well, upon the resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew in 1973, President Nixon appointed Ford to the vice presidency. And when President Nixon himself resigned from the presidency in August of 1974, Ford, as vice president, succeeded to the nation's highest office, thus becoming president. If you didn't know that, now you know. In Ford's short time in the White House, he was able to appoint one justice to the Supreme Court of the United States. In doing so, he replaced the following judicial legend, William Orville Douglas. Justice William O. Douglas was appointed to the court in 1939 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay? Douglas, in his 36 years and 7 months on the Supreme Court of the United States, would go on to become one of that body's greatest civil libertarians ever. All right? He was a judicial champion of the little man, civil rights, civil liberties, especially the right to privacy. Douglas always stood for whom he believed to be the downtrodden and the persecuted, all right? And as a matter of fact, one of his most famous sayings was the Constitution was not designed to be neutral. It was designed to get the government off the backs of the people. You know, he was a very blunt man who didn't spare anyone's feelings, all right? You know, a dynamo, legend in his own time. Okay, a controversial figure throughout his entire time on the bench. You know, Douglas was the victim of two impeachment attempts, the most recent being in 1970, all right, initiated by then Congressman Gerald Ford. Okay, the effort went nowhere, all right, but it just showed the dislike, at least at that point, that then Congressman Ford, who would later be vice president and then president, had for Justice Douglas. But staying on track, all right, Douglas served longer than anyone else on the Supreme Court in its history, 36 years and 7 months, all right? And, you know, it's highly unlikely that he wanted someone like President Ford to name his successor, but events didn't really give him much of a choice. On December 31st, 1974, while vacationing in the Bahamas, Justice Douglas suffered a massive stroke, which paralyzed virtually the entire side of his body, the left side of his body, rather. And, he had to be airlifted back to the United States. You know, it was a very severe stroke. You know, his condition was questionable, all right? So President Ford arranged for him to be flown back to the U.S. And, you know, as a result of that, he spent most of the court's 1974-75 term in and out of the hospital. You know, the stroke didn't render Douglas an invalid, but it significantly compromised his physical and mental abilities. He was, beyond question, not the same person he was before he had the stroke. You know, few people are, even if it's a mild stroke, but his was not mild, it was massive. Okay, and he's fortunate to have survived it at all, in truth. But, you know, in spite of this, he refused to step down. You know, his other colleagues on the Supreme Court, you know, noticed that the condition that he was in was no longer conducive to someone serving as, was not conducive to someone serving as a Supreme Court justice. I mean, like I said, his abilities were severely, weakened by that stroke. So his colleagues decided that any case that they had heard where Douglas's vote was essential to the outcome, they would just have it re-argued in the next term. Only Justice Byron White opposed this because he did not feel that other members of the court had the ability to essentially, mute out and remove all authority from one of their colleagues. And he's right, they didn't. Only Congress can do that by way of impeachment and removal. So, Douglas, was a stubborn man, and I think the stroke honestly made him even more stubborn and resistant to retirement. And even the exclusion by his colleagues didn't help push him towards retirement. All right. It would not be until October of 1975 when his doctor told him that his condition was not going to improve. All right. How he was how he was going to be for the rest of his life. All right. Keep in mind, this is 1975. Physical therapy and stroke rehabilitation wasn't what it is now. All right. So with that news, even though Justice Douglas would only live another 5 years from that point anyway, he finally gave in on the advice of his doctor, who had told him that this was probably in the best interest of his health to step down. And he gave in and submitted his retirement to President Ford on November 12th, 1975. All right, thus giving Gerald Ford his only opportunity to appoint someone to the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay? So with that in mind, President Ford left the work of compiling a list of potential nominees to his Attorney General, Edward Levy. Okay? Levy drew up a list of very qualified individuals for the vacancy, which included but was not limited to former Solicitor General Robert Bork, all right, who had served in the Nixon administration. He also included President Ford's Housing and Urban Development Secretary, as well as several federal appeals court judges, including but not limited to Judge Arlen Adams of the Third Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, Judge John Paul Stevens of the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and Judge J. Clifford Wallace of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. All right. And eventually this list was boiled down to two top contenders, Judge Arlen Adams of the Third Circuit and Judge John Paul Stevens of the Seventh Circuit. All right. Ford had respect for both men, and in reading their opinions, he was greatly impressed. Both men were conservative. They were moderates. They weren't radicals, and, they were respected jurists. Okay. One thing that turned Ford off about Adams was the fact that he was seemingly very flashy and arrogant, whereas Stevens appeared to be very modest, and humble guy like Ford himself. So it was very attractive, standout features for Stevens, okay? So that coupled with the fact that Edward Levy was a Chicagoan, just like Stevens, Levy strongly championed for President Ford to nominate Stevens to the Douglas vacancy, and the president agreed to do so, after much thought and consideration on November 28th, 1975, okay? Stevens' nomination was anything but controversial. As a matter of fact, he was a very well-respected and very well-received candidate, all right? He wasn't generally opposed by Democrats or Republicans, as, Stevens, like I said, was a moderate conservative who, was very balanced in his opinion. He was not a reactionary like some other potential nominees, which would have almost certainly gotten them rejected at that point, okay? So well did Stevens charm the Senate Judiciary Committee, indeed, with his answers. And, obviously, he was very appealing to the Senate as a whole, that he was confirmed just before Christmas by a 98-0 vote on December 17th, 1975, okay, to fill the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court created by the retirement of Justice William Orville Douglas. All right. For the record, when Douglas retired in 1975, after serving 36 years and 7 months on the Supreme Court of the United States. He had established the record as the longest serving justice in history, and he was the last appointment by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to leave the court. All right. So Stevens officially was confirmed December 17th, 1975 as a Supreme Court justice. And at the time of his confirmation, he was 55 years old. Justice John Paul Stevens would go on to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States for the next 34 years and 6 months, retiring in June of 2010 at the age of 90 years and 2 months. Justice Stevens' retirement in June of 2010 gave President Barack Obama his second opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice. And to replace the outgoing Justice John Paul Stevens, he selected Solicitor General Elena Kagan, all right, who at the time of this recording continues to serve as a justice of the court to this day. During Justice Stevens' 34 years and 6 months on the Supreme Court, he was overwhelmingly, a leader, okay, of the court's liberal wing, all right? As a matter of fact, aside from the first 5 years of his time on the court where he was still, pretty reliable conservative, from about 1975 to about 1980-81, Stevens was still, a reliable conservative. After 1981, Stevens moved further and further to the left, and certainly by the late 1980s, he was a firm member of the court's liberal wing, headed by then U.S. Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan Jr., and other members of that team were Justice Thurgood Marshall and Justice Harry Blackmun, all right? When Justice Harry Blackmun, the last of the old League of Liberal Lions, stepped down from the court in August of 1994, Justice Stevens became the dean and the elder of the court's liberal wing, all right, a position he would hold until his retirement in June of 2010, all right? Justice Stevens' approach to the law was a very pragmatic form of liberalism. Okay, Justice Stevens tended to examine the facts of each case very carefully and meticulously. He was also, at the time of his retirement, one of the few members of the court left who continued to write the first draft of his opinions himself, rather than having clerks do it. Clerks would come in later on, but he always did his first drafts on his own. Okay. Justice Stevens authored many notable landmark opinions, but I think his greatest legacy will be as a great dissenter, all right? As Stevens authored some pretty, awesome, to say the very least, dissents, especially in the cases of Bush versus Gore in 2000, District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, and Citizens United in 2010. Okay, Justice Stevens, arguably, I would say perhaps his most far-reaching opinion on the court that I can think of off the top of my head was U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton in 1995. Okay, in that case, Stevens wrote the majority opinion, which struck down an Arkansas state law that had purported to impose term limits on members of Congress elected from that state. Justice Stevens held, in his majority opinion, joined by 4 other justices, that the Constitution is quite clear on the election of members of Congress, and states cannot add laws, enact laws rather, that would add or undermine those qualifications, all right, already existing in the Constitution. So the court struck down Arkansas's law, as well as the laws of several other states at the time that had attempted to do this. Stevens was a very, strong believer in federal power over the states. He was not very big on states' rights at all, okay? As far as he was concerned, federal government in virtually any circumstance was supreme over the states. All right. And, he liked to often say that in spite of being a Republican and in spite of being appointed by a Republican president, he liked to often say that, he had not gone liberal, but the court had just moved to the right, which is only half true. While the court indeed did move to the right with the addition of Justices Sandra Day O'Connor, Antonin Scalia, and the elevation of Bill Rehnquist as Chief Justice in 1986, Stevens himself, too, did move left, all right? His opinions on certain things, such as affirmative action, which he opposed big time when he first got to the court, as well as capital punishment, which he supported when he first got to the court, His opinions on both of these subjects did a whole 180 by the time he retired. By the time he retired, Justice Stevens was one of the court's most passionate defenders of affirmative action, okay? And one of the most outspoken opponents of capital punishment. So, that proves his other statement to be true, that it was important to learn on the job, all right? And indeed, he did learn and grow while serving for 34 years and 6 months on the Supreme Court of the United States. All right. When President Ford was interviewed about Justice Stevens, whether he approved of his time on the court, and President Ford said absolutely, positively he did. President Ford is always a very humble, modest guy, not usually, hardly ever the type to bash and criticize, even if he did disagree. But Justice Stevens had gained President Ford's utmost respect and admiration, and the president responded that he was serving his country with dignity, exceptionally well, and without regard to partisan political concerns, which is very, very nice thing to say about your Supreme Court appointee. All right. So at the time, Justice Stevens retired from the court in June of 2010. Like I said, he was 90 years of age and 2 months. All right. That made him the second oldest justice in the history of the court to retire, putting him in second place, the silver medal, behind gold medalist Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who stepped down from the court in January of 1932 at the age of 90 years and 10 months, okay? When he retired in June of 2010, after 34 years and 6 months on the Supreme Court of the United States, that gave Justice Stevens the record of having the third longest tenure in the history of the court, after his immediate predecessor, William O. Douglas, who served for 36 years and 7 months from 1939 to 1975. Justice Stephen Johnson Field, who was appointed by President Lincoln in 1863 and served slightly longer than Stevens, 34 years and slightly more than 6 months, not retiring until 1897. Stephen Field served almost to the century's end. And thus, last but not least, it brings us to John Paul Stevens, who served 34 years and 6 months. So he's right behind William O. Douglas and Stephen Field. All right. Last but not least, with Stevens nearly 96 years old, towards the latter part of 2015, he then became the oldest Supreme Court justice in history, surpassing the record established by Justice Stanley Foreman Reed, who had passed away at the age of 95 in the year 1980. Okay, Justice Reed had been appointed to the court in 1938 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. All right, he retired in 1957. That is covered in another video. All right. And Justice Stevens, unfortunately, I say it with a heavy heart, passed away on July 17th, 2019, just before my 34th birthday, as a matter of fact, and he had always been a justice who I greatly admired, okay? And given how long he lived, he seemed like, he was going to make it past 100, and he almost did. If he had only hung on for, 10 more months, he would have done it. But, he lived a long, wonderful life, The world was very different at the time of his death than it was at the time of his birth in Chicago in the year 1920, okay? So that is John Paul Stevens, President Ford's only appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. Before I leave you, he was the author of several books. See if I can remember them offhand. Five Chiefs was one of them. He also wrote a book about several proposed constitutional amendments. And he published a book not long before his death in 2019, whereby, let me get the title for you, one second. Sorry about that. The book is entitled The Making of a Justice, Reflections on My First 94 Years. Classic Justice Stevens right there. If I live to be 94 or 99 years old, I'll be very grateful, and certainly in the great health that he was in up until the very end. All right? So I invite you to check out and learn more about Justice John Paul Stevens, a dynamic Supreme Court justice. Didn't agree with all of his decisions, but overwhelmingly, he was, a remarkably progressive and foresighted, powerful addition to the Supreme Court of the United States, whose absence is truly missed. Okay? So that concludes this video. I thank you all so much for listening. If you have any questions or controversies, just leave them down below. I'll be happy to answer them for you. All right? If you like this video, gained a little bit of insight from it, just drop me a like. I greatly appreciate that. And if you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, I invite you to do so now. Just hit that little red subscribe button, and we will be in business. It's totally free, and you just get updates when I post new videos. Take care. Stay safe out there. And I'll talk to you at the next bite. Peace.